We are in broadcast mode, I believe. So let me welcome you on behalf of the Stationers' Company and the Industry Committee. I'm delighted to welcome everybody to today's event. I'm Oliver Gadsby, I'm a publisher and I'm a member of the Stationers' Company. Our topic is Lend Us Your Ears, and we look forward to hearing more about the world of audio publishing in all its forms. I'm delighted that we have a distinguished audience of guests I see assembling at the bottom of the screen, as well as many members of the Stationers' Company. And I'm particularly pleased that amongst the latter is our new master, Robert Flather, who was installed on Tuesday this week. This is his first event in what will be an eventful year. Robert will say a few words at the end of today's event, including telling you about the 600-year history of the Stationers' Company. Oh, I'll just mention that we are, as you'll have seen, we're recording tonight's event for those who are unable to join us. The link and note of the event will be sent out to everyone who's registered. Beyond that, my only task is to introduce our host and moderator for this evening's session. George Walkley is a liveryman of the Stationers' Company. He's an independent consultant in the creative industries. He's had senior roles at Little Brown and Hachette, and certainly had a digital and audio focus. George, over to you.
Oliver, thank you very much indeed for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces here this evening from within and without the Stationers. But I'm not altogether surprised, because I think audio is one of the most exciting areas of media and publishing at the moment. And speaking personally, it's been a huge part of my career. One of my earliest professional memories as a bookseller was being given 3 boxes of BBC audio CDs to price sticker, which was a miserable morning. Though I suppose my first audiobook memory was actually the book and cassette of Steven Spielberg's E.T., which probably dates me a little bit. The last project that I delivered in corporate life was the construction of audio recording studios at Hachette, and I see some people involved in that here this evening, so nice to see you. Since then, as a consultant, I've been lucky enough to work on several audio projects. And it's a really vibrant area to be working in. Here in the UK last year, audiobook downloads grew by some 37%, and podcast audiences grew by nearly 20%. To explore some of that growth, let me introduce our 3 guests. Kelly Fairbrother is the CEO and founder of Zigzag, an innovative new British audiobook platform with some unique technology features, which I hope Kelly will tell us about. Hannah Russell is the CEO and founder of Mags Creative, a leading podcast production studio working with some big names. Finally, Jessica Tarrant is the content director at Yoto, an innovative audio player aimed at children. Now, I should declare an interest in that I've been lucky enough to work with each of our panelists at different stages of my career, and I'm really confident that they're going to have an interesting perspective to give you this evening. In a moment, I'll ask them each to tell you a little bit about their background and what they're working on at present. After that, we have some prepared topics which we're going to chat about for about 25 minutes or so. Finally, we'll have some time for questions from the audience in the final part of the evening, and I'd like to invite you to use the Q&A feature of Zoom to pose any questions. But for now, let's get started by getting to know our panel a little bit better, and I'd like to ask each of them to take 3 or 4 minutes to tell us a little bit about their background and their work at the moment. So, Kelly, good evening. Could I start with you?
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I'm very delighted to be here. I'm Kelly Fairbrother. I'm the co-founder of Zigzag, and I tell the story of Zigzag in sort of 3 books. It's our founding story, but I was listening to an audiobook, Hans Rosling's Factfulness on the London Underground, back in 2018. And the narrator comes on to tell me that in order to see all these brilliant infographics that make the book what it is, I had to download a PDF from a desktop website. The second one is Caroline Credo Perez, Invisible Women. And in order to, if I didn't want to have to buy an Audible subscription at $7.99, I had to pay $16.99 for that book on the iBooks platform. And the last one was Good to Great, which is this classic business book that was not available in downloadable digital format in the UK until 20 years after its publication date. And so we set up Zigzag with the goal of trying to solve these problems that we see in the audiobook space. We think we've built the best audiobook app in the market. Our technology takes human voice narrated audiobooks and indexes them to the ebook at scale, which just unlocks a whole load of really cool features. So now as you're listening, you can see illustrations, figures and tables, which makes maybe more formats, more genres available, like nonfiction and academic, relevant in audiobook format. You can search in an audiobook. You can do some pretty basic things that you would expect to be able to do with digital content these days, like take notes, share on social media. And we're just really excited about the audio opportunity. It's a really fast growing segment of publishing. And we do think that there's the room in this market for an alternative to Amazon. Thank you.
That's amazing. And just to sort of draw on that a little bit more, your sort of background, you're not a career publisher or media person. Your background is originally in consumer technology.
Yes, yeah, I've spent most of my time, I think, at the intersection of consumer, product, and technology, and had a very varied background, including at one time being a captain in the US Army, a long time ago.
Great. Now, Hannah, you and I had worked together at a sort of much earlier stage of digital publishing when we were talking about sort of ebooks as the priority rather than audiobooks. But you've gone into a slightly different segment of this market by looking at podcasts. Tell us a little bit about Mags Creative and your journey.
Absolutely. First of all, can I just say how to compete with following a captain in the US Army? I mean, I don't really know what to say thereafter, but I am not and have not been a captain in the US Army. But I did meet George very early on in my career when I was working in the ebook, but relatively nascent kind of emerging part of the ebook space. And I now run a company called Mags Creative, and we are one of the leading independent podcast companies here in the UK. So we make shows that reach a couple of million people every single month, and we do that in a couple of different ways. So in one hand, we're a services company, so we work with brands and individuals to tell their story through podcasts. So we've worked with Google and we've worked with Facebook to produce branded audio content that people really want to listen to. And the other part of that services business is that we also build audiences for podcasts. So people come to us with a podcast that may have launched and not done as well as they thought it was going to do, and we're real experts, having had backgrounds in kind of marketing and press and talent, at finding ways to find those audiences for those podcasts. In addition to that, we also produce Mags Creative Originals, which are our own shows. So we come up with an idea, we concept it, we develop it, we find the talent, and we continue to own and develop the IP for that show. We've been around for 3 years. So I started the business with my sister and the yin to my yang, Faith, and we've grown now to be a team of 8 and soon to be sort of 10, 12 by the end of the summer. So it's been a really interesting few years. And I think we started in the industry, in the podcast industry, when it wasn't new, because podcasting has been around for a lot longer, but it was certainly having the resurgence that we would all know of it now. And in that time, it has changed a huge amount. And I think that's going to all the kind of intersections here around podcasting and audiobooks and, the headphone generation is very much what I think I'm here today to discuss.
Excellent. And tell us a little bit about some of the people that you work with, because I mean, looking at your client list, it's quite varied, from sort of rugby internationals to Instagram influencers to sort of consumer brands.
Yeah, so we've done a lot of different types of work. And I think what we've always really focused on is finding a reason for that person to exist in the podcast space. So there are a lot of podcasts. There's not as many podcasts as there are songs or there are books, but the rhetoric is often now, oh, everyone has a podcast, do I need one? And actually, it's a really interesting and intimate way for people to communicate and to kind of really engage with their audiences. But for each of those individuals, it's a very different reason to exist. So you're right, we produced a show called Castaway, which the host of that is Laura Whitmore, who is also the host of Love Island, which is just starting up again. We've worked with Gareth Thomas, who is, as you know, a rugby international, and we've also produced shows for the likes of Facebook and Google, and marketed shows for the likes of the European Investment Bank and Red Bull. So it's a real mix of names in there, but I think, as I said, it's very much about finding that reason to exist in the space.
Excellent, thank you. Last but by no means least, Jessica, Yoto's had an amazing year, which I hope we'll talk about in a few minutes, but tell us a little bit about your journey there and what you're doing now.
Thanks, George. Yeah, so I feel like for an audio presentation, it feels weird to have to show something visual, but just to contextualize what we're talking about, this is a Yoto player, and Yoto is a screen-free audio platform for kids. And really the player is integral to the experience. The co-founders sought to sort of address the problem of the phone being central to a lot of the experiences that children have around audio. So, you know, if a child wants to listen to an audiobook or a certain piece of music, there was a point where a parent would have to get a phone out and maybe, you know, go to Spotify or go to Audible and play it manually through a speaker or something like that for them. And the co-founders thought that this was all wrong, really. You know, Ben Drury, our CEO, it believes a lot in Montessori principles of children sort of leading their own experiences. So the concept of Yoto was really born out of putting control back in the hands of children, so they could select what they listen to without the involvement of an adult whatsoever, and building a curated and safe environment for them to listen to this audio in. So the Yoto player works with Yoto cards, and this is really just a physical manifestation of a digital audio book. So we use NFC technology, and there's an RFID chip in each card, which links to the cloud, which downloads the audiobook directly onto the player. So the child just pops a card in and it plays the audio content for them. So we have a library of about 400 English language cards. It's growing really rapidly. My role at the company is content director, and my background is in children's publishing. So that's how I know George, through my Hachette days, working at Hachette Children's Books for several years. And yeah, we have authors from Roald Dahl to Jeff Kinney to Julia Donaldson on the platform. We work with brands like Disney and Lego. We also create our own audio where it's not available to be licensed. So in areas like education, phonics, things like that. And we have a micro podcast. So we really try and sort of, you know, run the full gamut of genres and types of audio content for children.
Excellent. I think the moment when I realized sort of over the last year just how big Yoto was getting was when the actor Alec Baldwin, who has several million Instagram followers, posted an Instagram photo in which his kid's Yoto player was very visible. That must have been a nice moment for you guys.
Yeah, I think that was relatively early on as well. We've sort of seen, you know, we launched our second generation player just ahead of the first lockdown, and we saw sort of really, you know, steady, you know, good growth through the year, but our spike was really over Christmas. But yeah, I think he was an early adopter. Certainly the Baldwins, jumped on our US launch around June last year quite early. So yeah, that was quite a thrill.
Excellent. I mean, that's a very neat segue into our first question, which is really sort of talking about the experience of the last year. All of the research from Ofcom and NPR Edison and others shows a huge boom in listening overall. So I hoped we could take a few minutes to talk about that experience and what you've all seen over the last year. Jessica, you started on this, so perhaps you'd continue for us. Are you still sort of seeing the market grow, and what sort of changes in consumer behaviour, if any, did you see over that lockdown period?
Yeah, I mean, for us as a company, it's quite hard to disentangle sort of, you know, pre and post pandemic, because, you know, we went live with our product just as the world sort of was changing really and going into lockdown. But yeah, certainly we've seen, you know, our customer base grow from pretty much zero to you know, we sold over 50,000 players worldwide now. So, you know, we've seen really impressive growth in terms of our consumer base. And you know, I think that there was a desire from parents during lockdown to have a screen-free alternative for their children. So I think that's really where Yoto sort of comes into its own. It's sort of taking children away from screens. You know, obviously they have their purpose, absolutely, they're essential in homeschooling, but you know, it's giving them an alternate way to experience audio and listen to audio in a completely safe space. So that definitely helped our journey last year. Excellent.
I mean, looking at a slightly different segment of the market, Hannah, I remember it always used to be a sort of a piece of accepted wisdom that a big part of podcasting was something that people would do on their commute. I certainly used to find it was a good way of filling some time. So tell us a little bit about the podcast experience over lockdown. Did that sort of drop away, or did you find that actually attention patterns stayed more constant?
It felt fairly catastrophic in March. So there was a week where we lost about 15% of our listenership overnight. And it was the commuting audience. So as you've said, historically, it's people listen to a sort of 45-minute podcast because that's the average commuting length in and around London. And that died. So we lost the commuting audience. But what happened very quickly was listening patterns changed. So people no longer necessarily listen on a commute, but there was a daily walk, and that very much became part of people's listening habits when they were sort of getting out of the house for that hour a day. People might listen later in the evening. So there was a real spike in the UK in women, single women listening to podcasts late at night. There was loneliness, there were people living alone. There was this real sense that, you know, podcasts are this really intimate form of way to connect with other human beings. And so the listening habits really did change. But what we saw by sort of September time of 2020 was that people were listening to about half an hour more podcasts than they had been doing previously. So listening habits increased, but they were really very different. And I think there are probably three other things that happened in the podcast space, which have all sort of combined. So the first was the sort of social audio movement. So there was Clubhouse, then there was Twitter Spaces, and it felt like this real bubble. And it suddenly, you know, all these headlines were saying, will Clubhouse kill podcasting? And there was this moment in the lockdown when we thought, oh my God, this is going to be it. But it didn't, and it hasn't. And I think it's going to be a really important part of audio moving forwards. But it's part of the mix, and for us, it's part of the marketing mix with podcasts. I think the second thing was that the desire to produce content increased. So celebrities were no longer able to go out and film. So there was this, this stuck at home, and suddenly it was like, I know what I'll do. I'll produce a podcast. So there was this real influx of celebrities and famous people into the space. Brands similarly were no longer able to go out and spend big budgets on video content. So there was this real kind of movement towards creating audio content in some form, because it can be done really well remotely. And then there was, I think, the continued rise in screen fatigue, which has just sort of led to this really sort of groundswell in the podcast space at the moment, which feels like lots of things have combined to lead us to the point where we're at the moment, which is a really kind of interesting pivotal moment, I think, where the industry has grown up as almost sort of accelerated by the last 12 months.
And as people sort of now begin to return back to offices, I mean, can I ask, what are you expecting? Do you think something that's more like the sort of the status quo ante in February of 2020, or something that's perhaps a blend of that and the last year?
I think it's always going to be blended, because I think the workplace and life has changed so sort of drastically over the last 12 months. So there will still be a commute, and it's a really important part of people's lives. But I think the way that content has now become immersed into the home is very different as well. So, the statistics around where people listen to podcasts were very previously either in the car in the States or, on the commute in the UK. And that number has risen really drastically to be in the home. And so I think there is going to be a shift, but it's going to be a kind of mix of the two.
Excellent, thank you. Finally on this one, Kelly, Zigzag, I think it's correct to say, is the newest of the three businesses we're talking about overnight, and so has had the experience of sort of launching over this extraordinary last year. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I would have loved to not have to launch during that period of time, I have to say, but no, I mean, it's really difficult to follow Hannah on this one, because actually what you get from her response is just this depth of insight and the power of data in telling you what has actually happened over the past year. And I think, again, this is part of our value proposition to publishers, is this idea that, with data, you can really understand what's actually happening in your audiences. And I think historically, that's not really been the visibility that I think publishers are able to get. And so the power of audio and the power of digital technology is the ability to see what people are actually doing. And a great example of this is the lockdown. We were expecting people to turn off as a result of not commuting. And actually, I think you said it, but the audiobook market grew by something like 42% last year, depending upon who you ask, I think. So that's a really positive outcome that nobody was expecting. The data actually shows you is kind of counter to what you're thinking. The other is, we expected people to want to download media And I think because people are staying at home, they're actually streaming more rather than downloading. So they don't need to take it with them. They're listening at home. And so that's been a really interesting, I think, again, shift for us in terms of our understanding. And no, it's just been really exciting. We only went to market towards the end of last year. So I think that the impact that it had on us personally was just signing publisher deals, which took far longer than we would have ever imagined they were going to take. And thank goodness we got George to help us out a bit, because I think he helped us, I think, refine our value proposition to publishers, to tell the story of what we were doing and how our interests are aligned in supporting them. And we went to market in December and started to acquire customers, and we've grown our customer base from kind of zero or about in the hundreds to over 6,000, 6,500, I think we're coming up on. So in not a lot of time. So yeah, we're feeling quite confident going into the year as well. And I would just again echo the themes that I think they've both made, which is on the one hand, people, not just children, are looking for alternatives to screens. So we're sitting on Zoom all day long, and actually who really does want to stare at a screen? People are listening as they go to bed, so it's a sleep aid for a lot of people to listen and to be able to pick up the next day. And the idea of just trying to have alternatives to being constantly on video and on display, I think is what people are looking for.
Great. We've sort of begun to move towards sort of the second topic that I was hoping we could dive into, which is what exactly it is people are listening to. And I think we got little hints of this in both Kelly and Hannah's answers. But Hannah, if I can jump back to you, you talked a little bit about this, but the type of content that people want to listen to, we talked about sort of lengths, we talked about sort of themes, but are there other trends that you see coming through? Are there areas at the moment that you're particularly excited about in terms of commissioning content?
It's a really interesting question, because I think if you look at the top sort of 20, 50 podcasts in the UK and the Apple charts, they would be very much centered around a few genres. So it would be news, it would be sports, it would be comedy, and it would be true crime. So that, historically, those would be the things that people would listen to en masse. But I think what's been really interesting about podcasts, and certainly about our business, is that we have really seen the value in smaller, more engaged audiences. So one of the podcasts that we run is a podcast called Welfare, the Running Podcast, with Amy Lane, who was previously the digital editor at Women's Health magazine. And that podcast has been in the charts, but isn't generally in the charts, but has a really, really kind of consistent, loyal, growing audience. And I think that's one of the powers of podcasts, which is that you are able to bring together these communities of 20, 30,000 weekly listeners, which is a really respectable number of kind of weekly podcast listeners, but they don't make it into the charts, but there's a real asset there that you've built. So I think it's about, for anyone kind of looking at moving into the podcast space, it's about really being clear on the objectives. Is it around massive appeal? And if so, it's probably going to be much easier to reach that with one of those kind of 4 or 5 main genres, or is it around building something for maybe a more niche community, but who you're asking quite a lot of them actually as well. So podcasts, audiobooks, all of these things, you're asking people to give, 20 to 40 to 60 to audiobooks, much longer minutes of their time. It's not this disposable kind of flicking screen culture. So I think it's just about looking at your objectives and working out what you want to achieve when you come into the space, and therefore what genre is right.
Great, thank you. Kelly, for you, sort of looking at the consumer audiobook market, are the trends of the books that sell sort of what you'd expected when you started? What are you seeing people buy today?
It's interesting, because I think we have the same challenge that Hannah just articulated, which is the challenge of, do you go broad or do you go niche? And I think we have toyed with this challenge for a long time, and we've decided to go broad and try to be as broad as possible in terms of our catalog and what we offer to people. We offer, again, adults all the way down to children and young adults. So we have taken this approach of being broad and as broad as possible. And I think it's really interesting, because we do see that in terms of our customer base, in terms of what people are listening to. It is quite a broad audience. And I would just make one point that I think is a really important one when it comes to audiobooks is that in some cases, the format limits the amount of content that's available. And I think I touched upon this before, but when entire genres aren't relevant for the format, and I think the traditional audiobook format has the limitations where a great deal of content isn't being made into audiobook format, largely because of the limitations of format. So if I can't see illustrations, but the book has a lot of illustrations, then you're automatically eliminating big swathes of content from being made available, which creates this kind of vicious cycle. And so I think one thing that we are trying to do is make a broader range of content also available, because then you create a virtuous cycle in which people come and want to listen. They can find the books they're looking for, or that they need to read for work, or that they want to read. And actually, if you make more available, then you drive more adoption, and you could possibly attract more audiences from the outside that maybe haven't really been considering, who don't really enjoy reading, but who have always found the limitations of the audiobook format too constraining. And so I think that's maybe a theme for us.
Great, thank you. I mean, Jess, I guess on that sort of question of sort of niche versus broad, I mean, Yoto is probably sort of much more on the niche side, in that, you have sort of one demographic of families with children that you're aiming for, and then within that you have very carefully selected content. Sort of what's sort of the ideal content that you're looking for today on the platform?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting what Kelly was saying about formats, because we've really seen the content that, or the stories that are most popular on our platform kind of echoing what you'd see in the sort of print book charts, which at the youngest end of our audience is picture book titles, which feels like a really odd sort of transition to audio. So Julia Donaldson's one of our most popular authors on the platform, and I think a lot of that speaks to the investment of publishers into how they transition something as visual as a picture book into audio. So certainly there's a very clear correlation between the titles that sell well for us and the production values of that audio. So where a production is has a lot of great music or sound effects, or a celebrity narrator, we definitely see that translate into sales for us. But in terms of broader genres, we see mindfulness as like a really, really popular area of our library. And I think, again, this might be harking back to sort of, pandemic times, and, what parents are conscious of, needing their children to sort of have access to. But yeah, content that sort of speaks to children and sort of says, okay, let's talk through some sort of, mindful activities, and, encourages them to sort of take a break. We see popularity there, and also in education. So again, back to sort of Kelly's point about the format, non-fiction's an area that I think lots of publishers have shied away from in terms of creating audio for those products, because they're so visual, a lot of the books that they're probably trying to adapt from. But one series that's particularly popular for us is Ladybird Audio Adventures, and this is published by Penguin Random House, and it's envisaged completely as an audio product. So it's a narrative journey, but with lots of non-fiction themes and facts, and it's laden with information for children, and that seems to be something that parents are really excited about discovering beyond just the typical audiobook universe.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Unbelievably, we're sort of about halfway through the prepared questions, and we're bang on time, which is a tribute to everyone, so thank you. A reminder to everyone watching that if you have questions that you'd like to get to in the general Q&A, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, or talk to us in the chat. We're monitoring that as we go. But I want to sort of move on to something else that we've sort of touched on as we go along, which is, I always think it's nice for people to leave one of these things with some practical advice. So if there are publishers or brands in the audience and they're thinking about this, what's the advice that you would offer them in getting started in offering either audiobooks or podcasts? Kelly, could we start with you on this one?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say, but of course I'm going to say that, is to consider alternatives to Audible. Just to think broadly about your channel strategy, and work hard to think about how you're going to distribute your audio and start really kind of from the consumer perspective. I think there are some great platform players out there who support aggregation of small publisher content and can get you access to a lot of different retailers rather than forcing you to go down the Amazon route. And then the second thing I would say is think beyond the limitations of the format. We are asked, that's what we're asking of people, is just to think that there's so much more that can be made in audio if you unlock the constraint of not being able to see what's being displayed. There's a great quote, I think, in I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, George, but in Rory Sutherland's Alchemy, where he describes this chart and then he describes it again, and he says, I'm describing this again because this is a bloody audiobook. And it's just like a perfect illustration of audio shouldn't be limited by a single format. And I think, Hannah mentioned the rise of Clubhouse. I love Clubhouse, but I want a direct chat functionality so I can be chatting as well as listening. And so maybe I'm just too multi-mode, but I do think about, not being constrained by what exists today and thinking about how do you build for the future. And we're just super excited about the opportunity. And so just starting to have conversations, starting to make some progress and think about what it might look like so that when you're in a position to do it, you're really well informed about what's out there.
Excellent, thank you. Let's move to sort of Jessica next. I can see, actually, I think we have some children's publishers in the audience, so this is your perfect moment to sort of pitch them. What advice would you sort of give them in getting started?
Yeah, I think I'd echo Kelly in saying don't be afraid to innovate. I think there are more opportunities now for your audio products to reach children's ears, of which we are one of those modes. So yeah, be innovative. I think you can. There's a lot still to be done in this area to sort of break it free of that sort of like linear model. So we're thinking a lot about sort of non-linear content, dynamic content, interactive content. Ways to really sort of lift it to the next level audio, but also coming back to my point about transitioning things from sort of page to ears. I think don't ever underinvest in sort of the production side of things either. I think it is, you can really tell. I am on a sort of on a big children's product, where they've invested in specialist production and effects and all those things. Certainly for this audience, I think really do make a difference in terms of the enjoyment and the execution of the product.
Excellent, thank you. Hannah, podcasts are a slightly different proposition to audiobooks, of course, and you've talked about objectives already. What other advice for people considering a podcast?
At the risk of sounding like an echo chamber, I had written down in my notes, be brave, which I think is pretty much just an echo of what Jess and Kelly have said. So I think when we started 3 years ago, we could launch a podcast that was one human having a conversation with another human, and it would be a big success if the people were famous enough or there was something attached to it. I think now there really needs to be a reason to exist. So that's the language that we use when we're talking to clients. What is the reason that this podcast needs to exist in this space? And there's 9 times out of 10 there is a reason, but it's just being really clear about finding that reason and sometimes being quite brave with how that is then executed, because it may be that the reason to exist is that we're going to experiment with a really interesting format, or that we're going to touch on topics that maybe are a little bit risky but are going to kind of give this podcast something that other podcasts haven't had. So I think being brave and making sure you're really, really clear on why is this podcast going to exist and how are we going to make it different to things that are already out there would probably be my words of advice.
Excellent, thank you. Now I'm going to ditch the sequence just momentarily because I'm watching the Q&A channel and we've had a couple of very specific questions come up for Hannah on podcasts. So I'm wondering, before we go back to the general discussion, while we're talking practical advice, can I jump in and ask you those now?
Perfect.
That's where we get to. So my fellow liveryman Steve Harrop has asked whether there's room, you think, in the market for a really niche industry podcast where you might only have a couple of hundred listeners.
100%. I think when we talk with people about starting a podcast, that setting of those objectives is really, really key to the process. So as I said earlier, there are podcasts where the objective is absolutely mass appeal. And if that's what you're going to do, then you need to think very strategically about what the topics are, who the talent is, how you're going to market it, what your budget is for launch. There are also shows where the objective is actually maybe reaching 100 people around the world. And there are business podcasts where they have such a clear idea of the people that they want to speak to. And there are 100 people. And if those 100 people are listening, they have met that objective, it's a huge success. So I think the question back would be, is that enough? Is that your reason to exist? If you can reach those 100 people, is the podcast a success in your eyes? And if so, then let's devise the project accordingly.
Great. And I'm going to combine two together. We have an anonymous attendee who's asked a question. Actually, no, I'll do these the other way around. I beg your pardon. Hermione Ireland has asked what sort of budget you need to commit to for creating a podcast, which I hope, Hannah, you might have a view on. And then from there's a question actually which would bring everyone else back in, which is how long on average does it take to produce a podcast episode or an audiobook? So maybe if Hannah, you could give a view on those two things, and then perhaps Jess and Kelly, if you have a view on audiobook production, and then we'll go back to our scheduled programming.
I think budget is one of those questions that always comes up, and is one of those also annoying answers where it is, how big is your budget? What have you got to spend on this? You can do it with a freelancer. People make podcasts with very, very little money. They record the podcast on their laptop that they already have. They use online editing software like Descript. They upload it they host it on a free hosting platform like SoundCloud, and then they upload it through the RSS feed to Apple and Spotify. You can do it for very, very little money. And I think then the question comes down to what the objectives are and how much is worth spending on it. So for example, if you were to work with a company like us, we would be looking at budgets starting at around £30,000 for a series of sort of 8 to 10 episodes of an interview series podcast. If you were to work with a freelancer in the middle, then there's a sort of budget there of a really wide range, depending on who you're working with, how much experience they have, and how much you're prepared to do yourself. But I think it does really vary from project to project. In some cases, it really doesn't make sense. If you're an individual or you are looking to try something, can be really experimental, I would say there is so much out there that you can do yourself. If you're looking to put some real production budget into something and work with a team of experts, as comes with an agency like mine, then the budgets sort of scale accordingly.
Great, thank you. And if we could sort of move on to sort of the question of how long to produce something like this. Obviously, you've just set out a spectrum from sort of DIY up to sort of very polished and produced, but what's a sort of sensible rule of thumb for how long to plan and record?
Oh, again, one of my favorite questions. I think, again, it varies massively. If we're working on interview format shows, often the blocker in time is talent and availability, particularly when booking sort of really high profile people. If you have guests lined up who are available and you have a really responsive team, we can turn something around probably in 6 to 8 weeks. And that would be us being sort of, we're a relatively small team, we're very reactive, we're very dynamic, but that also relies on the sort of counterpart being able to do the same. So I think 6 to 8 weeks, I would say, is probably the minimum from sort of, I want to make a podcast to let's get a podcast out there and people can listen to it.
Excellent, thank you. Jessica, in terms of sort of producing a children's audiobook, is there a rule of thumb?
I mean, similar to Hannah, it's a bit chicken and egg. I mean, in my sort of going back to my Hachette days, you probably need to give yourself a run up of, several months if like Hannah said, if you were, trying to engage some serious talent and book that in. And obviously within children's, it comes down to the length of the title as well. So, a much longer, a much longer book will obviously require more of that person's time than, a small picture book. But for us, I think we try to say that, we could set out to produce something and have it ready, have the audio files ready in a couple of months with a fair win. So yeah, it's definitely less time, let's say, than a physical printed book.
Yeah, excellent. And Kelly, I mean, Zigzag has worked with some self-published authors as well as sort of big publisher brands, hasn't it? Have you sort of formed a view on sort of production and production and how long things should take?
No, I don't have a view on that. Sorry. I think we are not yet in the space where we're making our own. We'd love to get there, but we're still quite early and need a few months before we're ready to set that all up. So.
Of course. Well, in that case, let me move on then and ask you the next question that we have, which is sort of the very nice one to ask. What's next for all of your companies? Hopefully this market is going to continue to grow for both podcasts and audiobooks. Kelly, tell me about the roadmap for Zigzag. What are you excited about and what are you hoping to deliver next?
Well, I'm excited about more publisher deals, hopefully. So we're close on a few, and so again, the ability to add more content to the platform is hugely important in terms of attracting new users. We continue to grow. We continue to improve both the app experience and the web experience. I think some of the challenges that we'd love to take is getting into production at some point, but I think that's probably not in our 6 to 9 month time horizon at the moment. But things like improving discoverability on the app, I think Carol asks this question around, how much does word of mouth matter? And is there the power of the audiobook club? We'd love to build the audiobook club, all of those club-based features, all the community-based features, that's what we're trying to build on top. And so we've got an ambition to do that. We do think that the other challenge there is that, right now it's too dominated by bestsellers, I think, in terms of the audiobook. We'd love to be able to delight people with a broader range of interesting content that we know they're going to love based on how other people love it. So using machine learning to serve up books and recommendations to individuals based on what we expect them to be delighted by, and maybe not everything that they would choose or just what is coming down the bestseller list. And I know that those things are difficult because often, we love bestsellers because they're really great books typically, but we just would love to be able to broaden the diversity of content that people are experiencing and getting exposed to. And so I think that's those are two really important dimensions of what we're trying to do. And I'd say the last one, sorry, just is trying to build out some partnerships. So working with either retailers or other partners that are playing in the publishing space that don't have a great alternative for audio, but would love to be able to offer it to their customers. How can we work together to create a place where you get compensated for sending customers our way, but we're delighting your customers on your behalf and allowing them to enjoy audio without really threatening your physical book or your own sales. So that's kind of how we're thinking about the next six months for us.
Great, thank you. Jessica, how about Yoto? Where do you go from here?
Yeah, there's lots of different directions, but I'll just speak to the content piece because obviously as a business we're going in lots of different directions in terms of hardware and software and things that I definitely shouldn't attempt to speak to. But from a content perspective, consolidating our position in the UK, certainly I think there's still some key brands and authors that we'd love to bring to the platform. So getting some of those real hero tentpole kind of properties on the platform is definitely an ambition, but also expanding our own production capacity as well. So filling those gaps, like I mentioned earlier, where potentially there is publishers maybe haven't had the capacity or the budgets to experiment, doing some of that ourselves and really trying to sort of lead the way in some of that in that regard. And then, in terms of sort of outside the UK, we are live in the US. We anticipate that that market's probably going to overtake the UK in the coming months in terms of revenue. So we're really sort of doubling. We've got a small team of 3 out there at the moment. So, growing our US team, increasing our sort of, US focused library of content is a key strategic aim for us. And then, just sort of really consolidating English language before moving to foreign language audio in the future.
Excellent, thank you. How about you, Hannah? What about Mag's creative in the podcast world?
So we have lots of things going on. But to talk to my point earlier around kind of different levels of podcasters and people who are able to do it DIY, one of the things that we're launching in September is a community platform, which is a subscription revenue model for ambitious individual podcasters. So we, as an agency-based business service, we're based on, providing a service. We're not able to help all of the kind of independent single podcasters that we want to. And there are some really incredible podcasters out there that the business models just don't match up. The numbers don't quite work. So we're launching a community platform which will allow us to, at scale, help individual podcasters to level up their podcast when they have already got their podcast out there and they just are looking to take things to the next level. That's going to be launching in September. And then for us as a sort of core business, we have some really exciting launches coming up over the next couple of months. So we're launching our most ambitious Mags Creative Original in November, which is a sort of semi-fictional narrative podcast, which we're really, really excited about. It's sort of taking us, I think, to a next level creatively and just really, it's a huge project, and it's been really exciting and scary and kind of a really big deal for us. So we're launching that in November. And then we have some amazing launches coming up with some of our wonderful clients as well over the summer and into September. So, and then we're also looking at India as a market. So India is the third biggest podcast listening market in the world. It has a really dynamic, growing, interesting market out there. It's also massively segmented because there's so many different languages. But with one of our flagship shows, we're sort of exploring the option of taking that format over to India as well.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious of the time, so I think we've got a few questions that have come in from the audience, which we'll try and get through. If anyone listening has any last questions, now's the moment to put them in, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. But I'll start with a great question from Tony Mash, who wants to ask about the difference between the UK and North American markets. Are the markets for podcast and audiobooks significantly different in those places? Can businesses actually run a sort of transatlantic model? Jessica, you're fairly well established in the US, and you were just sort of talking about this. Is there anything you'd sort of add to that? Do you see
we're giving it a go, I suppose I would say, like in terms of can a business operate in both places? That's definitely the ambition and the intention. And we're still, like I said, in terms of our staffing, definitely the US is sort of adjacent to the main UK-led team. In terms of the market for children's, I'm speaking to specifically there. Obviously the size is far bigger in terms of the market reach and the opportunity, but a lot of the themes are the same. And I think even more the emphasis around education and educational audio there is a real appetite for that in the States, and we've already seen that coming out of our customer base there, that they're supplementing home learning and indeed homeschooling, which I think is obviously a far more established practice there. So that's certainly an area of focus for us in the US that's similar but maybe a little different to the UK.
Excellent. Kelly, the US is home ground to you originally. What's your feeling on that market? Is it somewhere that we'll see Zigzag in the near future? Is it part of a longer term plan?
Well, my dad's been asking for a while, so maybe someday. But I think we're trying to focus on the UK market. And there are some real differences. Audiobook penetration in the UK still hovers at sub 15%, 15, and in America it's like 50%. So it's a much higher trial and much broader, bigger market, not just from the size of the US, but also just the penetration rates are from what I understand, a lot higher, which obviously means it's an incredibly attractive market, and we would be silly to ignore it. And I think the challenge for us is signing deals that take us to the US and give us access and still allow us to make some money in that market. But I definitely think it's a super exciting, and I do think actually, most of the relationships, if you're building something, you can build it quite globally now. Our entire infrastructure is quite global. Everything we've built is really global. We sell through the app stores, which are global. We market on Facebook, which is global. So it makes the ability to access global markets now, everything is set up for you to be able to do that. And so I think it's just a super exciting opportunity.
Great. Hannah, we talked a little bit earlier about sort of, the US market being sort of podcasts in cars and here being podcasts on the commute. What other sort of similarities and differences do you see?
It's just a much more developed market. So similarly to what Kelly was saying, that actually the difference in podcast penetration is not that different. So over here, it's about 25% of people listen to a podcast weekly. And in the US, it's about 28%. So similar levels of penetration, but bigger population and more developed. So I think it's interesting. And actually, to be frank, as a company, we haven't cracked it. So we don't have a huge amount of US listeners. We've made some sort of, I guess, tentative forays into the market with some of our shows where we secure a big US guest and see if that will help us to kind of bring the talent in. But I think there is something podcasts often feel quite intimate and personal and relevant to you. And so I think there is something about launching in the US that you have to, if you're going to do it, you're really going to have to do it. And you're going to have to understand, similarly to us in India, you're going to have to really understand the audience, really understand the market, make sure that it's localized, make sure that your marketing plan is completely bespoke to that market. And it's not something that we have sort of made massive gains in, but there are sort of similarities and differences, I think, between the two countries.
Excellent, thank you. We've got a couple of commercial questions which we'll try and sort of cover off before the end of this, but I think Hermione Ireland has asked a great question about sort of knowing how to price audio content, and if we could maybe take 2 minutes or so to sort of talk about that. If I start with sort of either Kelly or Jessica, what's your feeling on how would a publisher go about pricing content appropriately for the market? In this case, Hermione's got a very specific example of, sort of quite extensive non-fiction, 200,000 words. So, but perhaps so this is relevant to everyone. If you have any sort of general reflections, that would be useful as well.
I mean, I can pitch in, but on the very, very opposite end in terms of length. So we, when I joined Yoto, I sort of was really keen to develop a kind of quite a flat, transparent pricing structure around our audio cards, because I felt like actually the industry was a bit nebulous in terms of how pricing worked. So we have a very clear, pricing according to runtime. So anything under half an hour is $4.99. Anything 30 minutes to 1 hour 30 is $6.99, and anything over an hour and 30 minutes or 2 hours is $8.99. So it's a very simple structure just according to runtime. But obviously, when you get into the far longest books like Hermione's talking about, yes, that's a bit out of our remit at Yoto. So I wouldn't like to actually hazard a guess at the exact pricing there.
Yeah. Now, Kelly, I mean, you deal with many different publishers. You must have seen quite a lot of different approaches to this. What would you say in terms of consumer pricing?
Well, if I was being really crude, I would say that audiobook pricing is completely out of whack with what consumers are willing to pay, as maybe an unfair critique of the market. But so I think the first thing I would say in terms of really practical advice is just see what other people are selling their books for. But I think keep in the back of your mind that Audible has set a price for an audiobook in this market at £7.99, because that's what it costs to sign up for a 1 per month, quite inflexible, demand constraining, audiobook subscription. And so I just think that is the ultimate challenge is what is the value of content? It's ultimately what the consumer is willing to pay for it. And I think the challenge for this industry is how do you think about the consumer when you're also trying to balance the needs of your authors and the narrators and making sure everyone's paid fairly when consumers are actually paying quite a lot for content at the moment. And so it's a really tricky, we don't have the answer, but I would go out and have a look around and see what other people are able to price it at.
Great, thank you. Now we've got a few questions left, and I'm also conscious of time, so we may not get through all of these. I think this may be sort of the last question we get through before we give the floor to the master to conclude. So apologies to anyone whose question hasn't been answered. But just to end, how important is the narrator's voice? Is there a point where a human actor or reader is going to be replaced by a text-to-speech system or a computer? Hannah, you were talking about sort of intimate personal experiences. Can an intimate personal experience ever really come from artificial intelligence?
So I would say not in the next 12 months, but thereafter, I think all bets are off. So I think the way that we view the podcast space at the moment is very much around personality and talent. So I've talked a bit about celebrities and talent, and we've talked about widening the kind of the market size. And I think famous people, real humans, bring listeners into the space, and that is growing the size of the pot. But that pot ultimately is also really hungry for good content. And if that good content in the future is being provided by an artificial intelligence voice, I wouldn't rule it out. I would say for us, it's about personality, it's about relationships, it's about intimacy, it's about, understanding what someone really thinks, because you're listening to the quality of their voice and what they're saying as opposed to what they look like. And there's all these brilliant things about the podcast industry that I think hold true now. But I'm also, I'm gonna sit on the fence there annoyingly, I think, and leave it to Jess and Kelly to maybe come down harder on one side.
Sure. So Kelly, can we come to you next?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm with Hannah. I think it'll take a little bit longer. We looked hard at this technology. We started playing around with text to speech when we started, and we made the call that it's not good enough. We worked with, I think a leading innovator in this space is Deep Zen, particularly for audiobooks. And then there's some really cool gaming technologies that are, based in London at the moment that are actually using actors and paying actors, for their voices that are then regenerated using technology. And I think that's probably where it's most likely to go. But I still think it's quite expensive. It takes quite a lot of time, so I don't think we have the throughput. And I just think people want to, hear the voices of real authors. I mean, there's something brilliant about having an author tell you their story in their own voice, and listening to Stephen Fry still. So I'm not convinced that it's going to go wholesale over as well, but I do think there will be a mix. And I think I would give it more like 3 to 5 years than Hannah is a bit, more different in her outlook. But I think she's right that it's not happening in the next 12 months.
Jessica, you get the last word on this subject for now. So,
well, I was going to divert it away from artificial voices, because I think Hannah and Kelly have sort of said everything there is to say on that topic, and I agree. But in terms of how important is the voice that tells you the story, I think from our perspective at Yoto, it's incredibly important. And actually, one of the biggest use cases we have in terms of our customer base is people recording their own stories. So parents' voices, grandparents' voices, people that aren't in the room with the child, maybe are separated by an ocean or by just a pandemic, reading a child a bedtime story in their own voice and being able to link that to a make your own card. That's one of the most popular features of our platform. And so yes, I think the narrator is absolutely crucial, and if it's someone from your own family, so much the better.
Excellent. I don't know if people are following the chat, but I'd posed the question of whether an artificial intelligence could replace a professional actor, and the clerk of the stationer's company, a man who has acted himself, has responded very categorically, no. I think, Giles, I'm not going to disagree with you for this evening. At that point, I know that we're sort of about out of time. So I want to take the opportunity to thank Kelly, Hannah, and Jessica for sharing their perspectives. It's been absolutely fantastic and hugely informative. I now have the pleasure of handing over to our newly installed master of the Stationers' Company, Robert, to say a few words in conclusion. Master.
Well, thank you very much indeed, George, and thank you to our very, very eloquent panel of Hannah, Jessica and Kelly. That was really, really interesting. I've spent over 30 years in the book industry, firstly working for book printers and then for 20 odd years selling bookbinding machinery. So I'm very much in the heavy metal end and like the physical product. But I've always recognized that there are other ways of imparting information. Although we were a bit worried by what you were doing with ebooks at one time, it's all settled down and it's become what it is. It's complementary technology. And audiobooks I always saw as a slightly one-dimensional adjunct to the industry for those who had difficulty in reading, or prefer to hear it rather than reading it. But you've opened my eyes and my ears tonight, because that's really, really interesting talk that you've given us. about how flexible the technology can be and how much it can appeal to lots of different people. Just a couple of things that I picked up on. Jessica, I think what you're doing with Yoto is absolutely fascinating. I have a 3-year-old granddaughter. She doesn't have a Yoto, but she has something extremely similar, and she loves it. And if it introduces the youngest generation to the written word, albeit spoken, I think that's only good for education. It's good for our youngsters as they grow up, that they've had that level of quality education from the earliest age. So yeah, I think that's excellent what you're doing there. Callie, you touched on something that was fascinating, which was know your audience, know your customers. It's long been a thing in the magazine industry, in Europe, because most people bought their magazines from a newsstand. The publishers had no idea who their customers were. Whereas in the States, because everybody bought it by subscription, the publishers knew exactly who their customers were and tailored all the content accordingly. Now in the book world, it's exactly the same. The historic publishers don't know who their customers are because they're just buying them from the bookshop or even online. I'd rather they bought them from the bookshop. We need to protect those, but that's another story. But through what you were saying about knowing who is downloading the podcasts and buying them, etc., the publishers, historic publishers, can get to know their customers a lot better. Because once you know your customers and you know the data, you've got all the information then to generate content that the customers want. So I thought that was a really, really interesting way of extending our industry and extending the knowledge in our industry. And Hannah, I love what you're doing. Your information was really interesting, but it was the phrase, the headphone generation. For me, heaven was always sitting on a train, seeing 3 people reading hardback books around me. That was heaven. But clearly for you, it's sitting on that train and seeing everybody with the headphones in because they're listening to their podcasts. And I can see that is, it's another medium of communication. Audiobooks are so much more than the one-dimensional things I view them at an hour or so ago. So thank you all very much indeed for your contribution tonight. Very, very interesting. And I was trailed that I was going to tell you a little bit about the Stationers Company. So I am delighted as my first outing as master. It's just 48 hours since I was elected master to attend an industry event like this. Now I am conscious we have many stationers here, but I know there are also some who know very little about our company. So let me just give you a little bit of background. The Stationers Company is a City of London livery company that helps individuals and organisations in the communications and content industries to improve their performance and prospects. Our unique 600-year-old tradition combines conviviality, and we do plenty of that, with the enhancement of business and society, from the invention of copyright to the contributions we make today through education, training and charitable endeavour. Stationers Company has its roots in 1403, a long time ago, in the City of London, as a trade guild to protect the interests of manuscript writers and illuminators. Unlike most craftsmen in those days who were itinerant, Stationers set up stalls or stations around St Paul's Cathedral, and as a result acquired the name that we use today. Over the centuries, Stationers had good sense to embrace printing and every new technological advance in the communications and content industries, right up to today's digital media and online publishing. We have around about 1,000 members today, the vast majority of whom are actively involved in paper, print, publishing, packaging, office products, newspapers, broadcasting, online media and design, and machinery supply. So in the fast and ever-changing world, the Stationers Company continues to be a link from the past to the future. Tonight's event just shows how we can link experts and specialists and share knowledge about our fascinating industry. So thank you all very much for attending. Thank you. Oliver.
Thank you, Master. And I will just add to those thanks for a wonderful evening to thank George for bringing this fabulous panel together and for hosting the session so expertly. Just 1 point, well, 2 pointers for the future. Beyond that, first of all, if you've enjoyed this event, there are many more to be found on our website, stationers.org. Do have a look at what's coming up. And you can also apply for membership on that site, and all are welcome. the next industry committee event is on the 14th of September, with the annual event with the information technologists and marketers. There'll be a panel of change makers who will explore how our business sectors have adapted to the last 18 months of disruptive change. So that's something to look forward to. Meanwhile, I thank everyone, including and especially our panel, for joining us this evening, and I wish you a very good evening all round. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. It's been brilliant.
Thank you all very much indeed.